history who have been what we call gifted with the stigmata is considered a gift, even though it apparently in all of the people, the people who are documented, I'll talk about how many that is in just a minute, it induces great suffering, great physical pain in many cases. And I think in at least the 3 major cases we're going to talk about today, not only does it induce a lot of physical suffering, but in at least 2 of those cases contributed to an early death. So it is still considered a gift. But we use the term mystical stigmata is the official terminology, because it is a phenomenon that is not fully understood in either, of course, in the supernatural sense, which is difficult to fully understand or quantify or qualify anything that is supernatural, but is also not appreciated as what we call an incontestable miracle by the church. The church does not view these as incontestable miracles. And let me explain what I mean by that. Obviously, one of the more famous people who was gifted with the stigmata, you're looking at back here in this beautiful Peter Paul Rubens portrait from 1635. Everybody recognize him? That is Saint Francis of Assisi. No doubt one of the most obvious stigmatics when we think of them in history. He has some other distinctions I'll talk about when we look at his life. But in all of these people, there are 62 out of 381 appearances of the stigmata in history. Out of those 381, there are about 62 blesseds or saints for whom the stigmata is a manifestation that they bore in their lifetime. But it is not a miracle that can be used towards their canonization. Does everybody understand? That meaning, an incontestable miracle, meaning that which can be used, introduced as evidence at the canonization process for a compelling reason that this person merits sainthood. The stigmata is not. It is not considered that. So the church views this, I think, with some caution, rightfully so, but neither is the phenomenon fully explained medically either. Okay, how many medical doctors I got in here today? 1, 2. Y'all want to come talk about this? No? Sure. Well, I do have some very limited information that I can share with you from the little bit of research that I did from the physiological perspective of this. But I will tell you this, that the words come to mind of someone I met not long ago when I was introduced very formally, which, you know, those of you who know me know I don't really like that. And as a matter of fact, I often tell people, please call me Cheryl. The only people who have to call me Dr. White are my students. But I was introduced as Dr. Cheryl White, and this person looked at me and said, well, what kind of doctor are you? And I said, well, I'm a history professor. Oh, well, you're not a real doctor. No, I'm not. I'm not a real medical doctor, and so my knowledge in that, as I say, my ignorance extends into many areas, and that is one of them. So don't feel bashful about jumping in and correcting my terminology or references if you need to. But from what I do understand, medical science has not been able to really explain this phenomenon either. And in many times, as in the case of at least one rather famous stigmatic from the 20th century, of whom we have video and photographs of, who has probably been the most studied from the medical perspective, there is no explanation. He's left over a dozen doctors shaking their heads. And you probably all know I'm talking about St. Padre Pio. So the supernatural cannot be proven. We've talked about sort of the theme of miracles all term, right? You know that the realm of the supernatural is not something that we can prove. We'll never be able to prove. The very definition itself means it is beyond our natural capacity for understanding. So we're never going to be able to prove it. But as I said, in many of these documented cases of the 20th century, we have more direct observation-based evidence We know that the wounds themselves do not heal at all in many of these individuals. They never go away until one particular moment. They never worsen. They never become infected. They never rot. They never emit an odor. But instead, and again, in at least the case of one in particular, St. Padre Pio, the odor was said to be sweet and flowery. Okay? So, where does the word stigmata come from? Well, we use a word in the English language to be stigmatized. Have you ever heard anybody say that, stigmatized? So the word stigmata is a Latin derivative that comes from the Greek stigma, which means a sign. It means a mark, a physical, not necessarily a physical mark, but a mark or a sign that is obvious to people. And so, classically, in the classical sense, the stigmata are the wounds that were inflicted on Christ during his passion and suffering. So these marks, these signs, can take many forms. The most common is for someone to bleed from their hands and or their feet. To have the full stigmata, as it's called, is to bleed from all of the wounds of Christ: hands, feet, side, forehead, and sometimes the nape of the neck as well. And again, and I keep going back to Padre Pio, and I've actually saved him for the end, but I've already mentioned him more than I have anybody else. In the case of St. Padre Pio, he also bore an incredible wound on his shoulder that was an abrasion that would never heal. And from the very place that, of course, if you understand anything about crucifixion and the route to crucifixion, that this patibulum, the crossbeam that Christ would have had to carry would have been on his shoulders. And so there is on display one of his undergarments now that you can see. He bled through the shoulder every day of his life. This abrasion never healed, but again, never worsened either. So to have all of the wounds of Christ is a little bit unusual, but a couple of stigmatics in history have done that. Think about what the word means today. Today, when we use the word stigmatized, if we talk about someone being stigmatized, we are saying that they have been publicly wounded in some way, right? So the word has sort of come down to us to mean a wounding of type. And I did not mention this, but there are a few in history who also bear scourge wounds. That's the other, of course, major wounds of Christ inflicted at the Passion. But usually, as I said, it's just the hands and the feet. There's also another almost impossible to study aspect of the stigmata, and that is in individuals who have claimed to have the invisible stigmata. Now, the invisible stigmata means that you suffer from the pains of the wounds of Christ, but you don't physically manifest any sign of them. And of course, how would you ever document that? In one person in history who is known to all of us, we're going to be talking about her week after next in preparation for her feast day, St. Catherine of Siena, who also had the stigmata. When she received the stigmata as a young woman, she prayed that her suffering would be made unknown to those around her. So we have a documented record that she bore the physical signs of stigmata, and then after her prayer, she did not. And she says that she suffered the rest of her life with this pain from the invisible stigmata, and y'all know that she died at the age of 33. Her health continued to deteriorate, even though she no longer bore the visible signs of the stigmata. So whether or not one accepts a physical cause as being the explanation, or whether you accept a supernatural cause, I'm not sure that it matters for the purposes of what we want to talk about today, because history speaks very loudly about this issue. Very loudly. As I said, there are so many instances that are documented particularly throughout the late medieval and into the early modern era, and at specific points in history. It's interesting to look at them cyclically. Like, where are they clustered together? There's a whole cluster of them in the 13th century. And that's one of the things I really am fascinated by. We're going to talk about today. Why so many in that century? And I think we have some answers. And then you see them again like in the post-Protestant world. You see many in Catholic countries. All right? And then we have another sort of resurgence of the phenomenon in the 19th and 20th century that has benefited from the advent of photography. And later in the 20th century, we have video of some of these. So it is probably incredibly well documented. To decide merely the facts of these, like give you dates and persons and when this appeared and how much they bled or whatever, without exploring a supernatural cause, though, I think we miss an important message. If we were to just deal with this historically, and I gave you a rote list of people who had it, or how it manifested itself in their lives, and the eyewitnesses who saw it. In the case of Francis, there's so many accounts of this. I think we miss something very important if we don't at least entertain the idea that there is an explanation beyond our realm of understanding. And that's how, remember we began this semester. I'm sorry. I can think in terms of semesters. I can't help it. Father Peter laughs at me about this all the time because I'm talking about the fall semester already. He's like, it's not a semester. No, it is. That's how I think. It's how I program. But one thing we've talked about all spring has been this idea of our supernatural faith. And that as Catholic Christians, we know that these things happen supernaturally. We are a people of faith. We believe that God is still speaking, God is still working. Not telling us anything new, of course, but speaking to us through other people and through wondrous signs and miracles. So I would challenge us to think about that this way today. All right. Now, how many of you remember the day that we did a foray into philosophy? Do y'all remember that? Anybody remember here? Were you here that Sunday when we talked about miracles and sort of their place in philosophy, how philosophy through the ages has viewed miracles and explained miracles? And remember, we hit this huge bump in the road in about the 18th century called the Enlightenment, where everything began to be questioned that had been held, anything that had been held before with any sort of sacredness or anything that was authoritative before the 18th century was increasingly viewed with more and more and more suspicion. So by the time we reach the modern world, which is the Enlightenment age of the 18th century, and certainly by the postmodern world, which is where we are today, mid-20th through the 21st century, we don't, and I say we meaning the collective world, to believe in miracles anymore. Right? Y'all remember the story about Jefferson cutting all the miracles out of his Bible? Mm-hmm. I told that story. And increasingly here, we live in a very skeptical secular world, and everything is subjected to scientific scrutiny. Well, people, this is something we can't prove scientifically. So in our post-Enlightenment world, the stigmata is viewed very differently out there than it ever would have been before. The medieval Christian would have taken this as a sign, a true stigma, a sign, a mark. And today, if somebody in our cathedral parish suddenly said that they were manifesting the stigmata, what would be your first reaction? Suspicion. And go ahead and say it. It's okay. It's okay. You know what the gospel reading is today? It's my favorite. It's my favorite. It's Thomas. It's my favorite reading in the Gospels. There's nothing wrong with being skeptical or suspicious. There's nothing wrong with it. My point is that I think we are even more suspicious today than we ever would have been before. But that is a liability of having reached the place where we are technologically, scientifically, and having the amount of knowledge we do today that was not available to the medieval Christian. So it is very complicated. And like we have explored in here before, the fact that there were lots of hoaxes and frauds, yes, stigmatics who claimed to have this gift, who were exposed as hoaxes or frauds, because we've had that, it does, I mean, just like the relics trade. Remember we talked about the relics trade. It introduces in us a natural, but I think not unhealthy, suspicion. The new intellectual perspective that we have casts doubt on a lot of things for us. And I think what sets the Catholic Christian apart, even when we are suspicious or skeptical, is that we still know in our heart of hearts that such a thing is possible, don't we? We know that it is possible because with God all things are possible, and we believe in miracles. We believe in miracles. You cannot just summarily dismiss all supernatural events and all miracles because of our human brokenness and our interference, and the fact that there are people out there who would do something as a hoax or a fraud. So by the turn of the 20th century, medical doctors began to undertake a lot of investigation of these claims in some of these people, and began publishing in peer-reviewed journals about this phenomenon. And many of them you read, particularly around the turn of the 20th century, are written very objectively, as an honest sort of medical scientific inquiry trying to get to the bottom of this phenomenon. And again, written from a medical perspective, a scientific perspective, without doubting at all that they were true, without casting any doubt at all on the legitimacy of the phenomenon, but simply seeking to understand the mechanism. Does that make sense? So rather than saying this is all a joke, the first medical doctors to really look at this in the first decade of the 20th century, 1909, 1910, is when you see a lot of this being published. Many of them are simply saying, let's explore this. We don't doubt it. Let's just see if we can understand it. And documented, of course, in certain period of history. So, as I said, there have been, according to the best records we have, 381 people documented stigmatics in history. Now, this means people who have said or claimed that they have it. Okay? Meaning that these wounds were witnessed by others. I'm not speaking to their authenticity, but meaning that their wounds were witnessed by others in a way that adds some veracity, right? Some level of truth to the personal claim. Now, it might not surprise you to know that there are hundreds more who claim that they had it that are not counted in that number, that were not necessarily witnessed by anyone, that we don't have even the beginnings of an understanding. So we've eliminated those from that number. So we're left with 381. And out of that 381, there are 62 who are either saints or blesseds, in whom the stigmata is considered authentic. Okay? That we can say with, I think, absolute confidence that these people did in fact bear the wounds of Christ in a physical way. 62. Among whom the best known are Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Catherine of Siena, and Saint Padre Pio. And there's lots scattered in between. Y'all didn't want me to come talk about all 62 saints this morning, did you? Because, you know, I can be here till about 4 o'clock this afternoon. Y'all want to stick around. We're talking about a lot. And again, many, many more we could talk about. What's interesting also is that in that 381 number, less than 40 of them are men. 38 or 39 are men. Now let me tell you what's interesting about that is, again, if you look at its distribution over time, and this is something I really had hoped to plot out But, you know, I have a day job, and so sometimes I get distracted sometimes by my day job. But what I'd really hope to do is be able to take the data and create a table for you and show you by century, by sex. Because what's interesting is that throughout the Middle Ages, and really up until about the 19th century, the major cases that are reported are women. I mean, obviously, St. Francis, not, but most of them are women. And then we get to the 20th century, and this becomes increasingly more of a male phenomenon. We see more men. And what does that mean? I have some profound thoughts. Not. I have no idea. I don't know what that means, but I suspect that there is probably a socio-religious kind of answer that we could explore at some point. Here is a fun fact. There are absolutely no cases of the stigmata reported before the 13th century. None. Nobody in all of church history until 1224, the year 1224, does anybody mention, reference, claim to have. There's absolutely no record until the 13th century. The very first mention is Saint Francis of Assisi. The very first. And what does that mean? Does it surprise you to know I really do have some ideas about this? I really do. And remember the church, we looked at this idea in the fall, you know, the church has its militant earthly form, and it has its triumphant form that's beyond our realm. And I honestly believe that there are earthly explanations for why, sociological explanations for why you see the manifestation in the 13th century and beyond, and not before. This particular saint, of course, is known primarily for what virtue? His humility, his incredible humility. And we have an indication, remember, that he's the first really medieval saint that there are a lot of eyewitness, primary source documents. Men who were friars in his order, men who were with him, people in these communities where he visited who had encountered him. We have an incredible wealth of information about Francis's life. Unlike, if you look at some of the other medieval hagiography, like saints from the High Middle Ages and early Middle Ages even, and if you go back, reach further into classical antiquity, for people like Agnes or Agatha, for instance, or Saint Cecilia, there's so many of them that the hagiography is sparse. We just don't know a lot about them. And much of it was very early tradition. What begins to happen in the high to late Middle Ages is people begin to write things down. So we have these really rich accounts from people who knew Francis, who witnessed this. And I'm talking about multiple ones who witnessed it. And Francis, in his humility, apparently tried to discourage this. He tried to discourage it being written or published about. He could not prevent that, obviously. Imagine being the first that this happens to. Imagine that. Everybody's going to want to write it down, right? So as I said, a number of contemporaries reported in various social histories. It's not just accounts from his friars, and it becomes very well known. It was well known by many. So on September 14th, the feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, September 14th of 1224, Saint Francis, it was a Saturday. I don't know why that's important, but anyway, it was a Saturday. Saint Francis had been engaged in about a month-long retreat with several of his closest friars in the order, and they were at the river Arno in Italy. And he entered an intense period of meditation and prayer. Just friars report that he was gone for many hours. I don't know what that means, if that's 6 or 8 or 20, I don't know. But that he was gone for many hours. And he told his fellow brethren there that he was going to contemplate the mysteries of Christ's passion. That was really what he had intended the focus of his retreat to be, and he was going to take this opportunity to spend these hours contemplating the wounds of Christ. He had already been fasting severely, which is something else that shows up frequently in Francis's hagiography, is that it's a report of him that he sometimes fasted, they thought, too severely, and may have contributed again to his weakened state. But this is what is reported, and I think I have the exact quote that comes from. This is actually quoted from something called the Fioretti, which is a little flower, okay? But it's the little flower of Saint Francis of Assisi. It's a collection of accounts, an anthology, if you will, of accounts of him. And if you read that, you come to the following account, and it says, quote, "As he knelt to pray in the first light of dawn that day, he began, as he said, to contemplate the passion of Christ. His fervor grew so strong within him that he became wholly transformed, W-H-O-L-L-Y, wholly, completely transformed into Jesus through love and compassion. While he was thus inflamed, he saw a seraph with 6 shining fiery wings descend from heaven. The seraph drew near to St. Francis in a swift flight so that he could see him clearly and recognize that he had the form of a man crucified. After a long period of secret conversation, this mysterious vision faded, leaving in his body a wonderful image and imprint of the passion of our Lord. For in the hands and feet of St. Francis forthwith began to appear the marks of the nails in the same manner as we saw them in the body of Christ crucified. From this point forward, Francis bled daily. Daily. So, in all, over the next weeks, Francis found that he bore 5 marks. 2 on his palms, 2 on his feet, and the very last manifestation that he received about a year later was a pierced wound in his right side that apparently was quite painful. This is the very first case of stigmata that is ever described in history, is Saint Francis of Assisi. And I think in many ways it's a poignant thing, isn't it, that it is Saint Francis of Assisi? Someone who is so well known for his humility. I think the credibility of this man is such that even in our contemporary world, nobody doubts the saintliness of this man. Remember that he is the one who went to St. John Lateran. I told y'all this story last fall. He's the one who went to St. John Lateran to meet with Pope Innocent III, that incredibly worldly pope, probably the most worldly pope of the Middle Ages. And he begins down that long aisle going up to the papal throne in St. John Lateran. Some of you may have been in St. John Lateran and know exactly what I'm talking about. And on his hands and knees crawling forward to the Pope, wearing only his tunic that he was, by that time, had been wearing a couple of years. And here is Pope Innocent III seated in all of his papal regalia. The papal tiara is probably glistening because he just shined it up really good for this public appearance. And what does Pope Innocent III do? So profound was the reputation of St. Francis already that Pope Innocent III, the most worldly man in the world, became Pope at the age of 26. Worldly man in the whole world. Came down off of that papal throne and crawled on his knees to meet Francis. Lifted Francis up and said, "It is I who should prostrate myself before you." This man's humility was so well known. So do you think it's an accident that this is the first man in history in whom this is recorded? I don't think so. I think it gives us so much more of veracity, again, to this particular account. So in the intervening 800 years between 1224, that Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, in 1224, when St. Francis is gifted, that intervening 800 years until 2018, the mystical stigmata is very well documented in many, many people. The extensive record in many of these cases gives us an opportunity to compare and contrast the stories, to see what are the points of agreement, and it's pretty remarkable. The way they manifest themselves, the way these particular wounds behave as observed by medical science. So one of the most obvious questions might be, before we go any further, is why the stigmata phenomenon does not appear before 1224. Why it doesn't. Why 13th century Italy? Why this former rich man of Assisi? Why are there no reports before? This is actually, okay, so everybody, I told y'all, this is Peter Paul Rubens, a famous painting from 1635 of Saint Francis receiving the stigmata. And everybody see the seraph here? This is actually, you're missing, I think, the top of the painting there. The seraph is actually crucified. This is a cross the seraph is crucified on. The way that Francis's friars describe the scene exactly. And then this is the version of it from Giotto, who's a little bit early, of course. Giotto is a very early Italian Renaissance figure, but paints it the same way, except in this scene, who does the seraph appear to be? Christ. Right. Christ giving the stigmata to St. Francis. So this is what I think, and this is where I feel like history has something to contribute to our discussion about stigmata, is to place this in its historical context, because a lot of times phenomenon and events in the Christian narrative, in church experience, church history, are framed very much by the social conditions and what's going on in the bigger picture. And so I don't think that this is an accident. There's just so much rich stuff here, socially and theologically, that's going on in the 13th century. By the 13th century, there is a much greater emphasis, for instance, on Christ's suffering. His humanity began to take more and more and more center stage. And I'll tell you why this is. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why. But let me give you a little bit of historical background to this. Going back to that Pope I mentioned, Pope Innocent III. After the Fourth Crusade in 1204, that ended in 1204, Pope Innocent III learned that there was a group of heretics in southern France, in a particular region of southern France, who were teaching what was really an old heresy. This is what we could refer to as the Albigensian heresy, because they're from a region called Albi, France. Very old heresy is that the God of the Old Testament could not possibly be the same God that's incarnate in Jesus Christ, and that these were somehow two different gods. Okay? This is what landed, made the blip go off on Innocent III's radar as he heard that they were teaching this, because it is an ancient heresy. And they were saying that, that this Jesus could not possibly be, have the divinity that's described in the Old Testament. Okay? So there is a greater emphasis in putting down that heresy of southern France. Incidentally, that's when the Holy Office of the Inquisition came into existence, was to help wipe out the rest of these heretics. Can I take a little rabbit trail? Will somebody remember to get me back on track? This is too fun to not talk about. There's an extreme subsect of that group, the Albigensians, an extreme radical group of them who thought they could bring about the end of the earth, the end of the world. They were going to bring about the end times. And the way they could do this was by stop procreating. We could stop all human procreation. We could bring about the end of the world. And this is what really inflamed the Pope. So a couple of interesting things come out of that is, they're gleefully practicing abortion and infanticide. Nobody said anything about abstinence. Now, don't get me wrong. They're talking about stopping procreating by stopping by having children. So Pope Innocent III wrote what's this beautiful encyclical about life, and is one of the earliest to equate abortion with murder in the 13th century, even though they don't have any understanding of embryology or anything like we do today. So that comes out of that, and it also, of course, leads to one of the more famous statements in history that has been attributed to Pope Innocent III, when he was asked, why going into southern France, aren't we going to kill some innocent people? And he responded by saying, kill them all. God will find his own. And that is the origin of that expression, one of the earliest origins of that expression. So my point is that this passionate, impassioned Pope, who was so rigorously trying to defend the traditional Christological understanding of both Christ's humanity and divinity, focuses now more than ever before on the humanity of Jesus, on human suffering of Jesus. So the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, again, Pope Innocent III, leads to a very important formalization of a doctrine that we call transubstantiation. This is the official sanction that is given to that teaching at Fourth Lateran in 1215. Official sanction. This is not new theology. I want to be very clear to say this. To believe that the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ is ancient. It's in the fathers. It's in the earliest Christian fathers. But they don't describe it in a material kind of way, a literal kind of way. Transubstantiation teaches us, look at the word, trans, there's a change. Substance. There's a change in the substance of the elements. They become the actual flesh and blood of Christ. So this teaching at 1215, and maybe some of you are already seeing where this is going, this teaching directs many Christians towards a more literal understanding of flesh and blood. There is a much greater emphasis, and even in homiletics, as priests and catechesis, as new Christians are being taught in this century, they're being given a lot more information about Eucharistic theology, about Jesus' humanity, his suffering, blood. So I think that's a huge, I cannot overstate the significance of this particular development at the beginning of the 13th century. Look at the year we're talking about, 1215. When does Saint Francis have the stigmata, the manifestation? 1224. So naturally, the great mystics of the Middle Ages are now going to concentrate, what? On a physical humanity. Their meditations are directed at physical suffering. And one of the best, I think, existing scientific explanations out there is that this intense meditation on this physical suffering, the physical wounds of Christ, can manifest itself psychosomatically. That you can actually bring that suffering into existence. Does that make sense? It's one of the natural explanations that has been given for this. And again, something else that you really have to understand in context is that by this time of 1215, we have finished the Crusades. The works of Aristotle, the great material philosopher, the one who believed that everything had to be quantified physically. Those works of Aristotle, which had been largely lost to the West, find their way back into Western Europe with Christian crusading armies coming home. They bring back Arabic translations. It just happens to coincide with the rise of scholasticism, the rise of universities in Europe, and you've got people like the great Dominican St. Thomas Aquinas, who is taking all of that Aristotelian thought and synthesizing it into church doctrine. Y'all, transubstantiation is Aristotelian. You understand that? It's a physical, literal explanation. When before that, when we talk about the real presence of Christ, that's understood by the early fathers, the early fathers are saying the same thing, but they're saying it in a more mystical way. We don't understand it, but there's a great mystery at the Eucharist. Okay, so this physical focus, I think, plays a huge part. The Feast of Corpus Christi. The Feast of Corpus Christi was created by Pope Urban IV in 1264, just 40 years after St. Francis has the stigmata. But lest you think those two things might not be related, the feast was really promoted beginning during the lifetime of Francis. And it was actually promoted, it was called for by the work of a woman, Saint Juliana, who petitioned the Pope to create what we call a devotional feast that was just devoted to the body of Christ. The body of Christ. She herself had a series of visions. Now, she was not gifted with the stigmata, but she herself claimed that the reason that the Pope was supposed to create the Feast of Corpus Christi is because she had received a series of visions from a crucified Jesus, still on the cross, informing her that this needed to happen. I don't want to go down that rabbit trail because that's a long one, okay? The role of St. Juliana and the role of the Feast of Corpus Christi in medieval society is just a remarkable story because it really brings people out of the churches and into the streets in a profound way. Anyway, my point is that following the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, there was a greater tendency to encourage contemplation of Christ's physical suffering. Not surprisingly, and you know I'm all over this, there is also a theological trend that begins to show up in art in the 13th century. The 13th century. It shows up in art in the 13th century. Painters, and particularly men who are working, monastics who are working in scriptoria, producing those beautiful illuminated manuscripts. If you looked at an illuminated manuscript from the 12th century, you're going to see Jesus on the cross with no blood, no wounds. He's very beautifully affixed there, and he usually appears very peaceful, as if he is sleeping. And what begins to happen by the 13th century is this. Devotional literature, this is from a medieval manuscript of about 1250. What do you notice? Look here. You see this? Can y'all see this over here? This Jesus is bleeding. Okay? This Jesus is bleeding. So this is kind of an interesting new phenomenon. Arguably, even now as I'm looking at that, I'm wondering if the artist has also given him a wound on his cheek. Can't really tell. But certainly you can see the blood flow. And so this begins to appear as sort of a pattern in devotional literature, becoming increasingly more graphic in the portrayal of Christ's blood. And y'all, this is fascinating. This theological trend that finds its way into artwork, we are so informed by culture. Would you think that people of the past weren't either? Of course they were. They were informed by the same things that inform us today, the culture we live in. And there is a really bizarre, this sort of bizarre social example I'm giving you here of this tendency to over-contemplate, perhaps, the crucifixion. In 1222, 2 years before Saint Francis received the stigmata, there was an English peasant. Now, y'all, this is an extreme example, okay? Please don't take this away as the model. Please don't take this away as a model of anything other than something incredibly bizarre to contemplate. This is not the standard norm of stigmatas. As a matter of fact, this person's not a stigmatic. But I tell the story because I want to illustrate an extreme social reaction. So in 1222, there was an English peasant who was hauled before a court in England and charged with heresy because he claimed he was the Son of God. And in order to prove this, he had himself crucified. So whenever I tell the story in History of Christianity, my students always, the first thing, somebody always jumps in and says, well, how do you crucify yourself? Well, wait for the rest of the story. We're pretty sure he had an accomplice that assisted him with this. The details of this particular crucifixion of this English peasant do not survive. Neither does his name, by the way. But the record survives in Lambeth Palace in London. So he has himself crucified to prove that he's the Son of God. And obviously those wounds were not fatal because he was brought to court for heresy. And he was sentenced by Archbishop Canterbury Stephen Langton, to spend the rest of his life in prison. And actually, Archbishop Stephen Langton it's actually written into the record that after you read the man's charge and his sentence, this sentence appears, quote, a deranged madman. Okay? So that's an extreme example of what I'm talking about, that you have people attempting to crucify themselves. Did Saint Francis ever know that? I hope not. I mean, I hope he didn't ever hear that story. The other thing that I would say, and we'll get to Padre Pio in just a second. The other thing that I would say is that I think might be a contributing factor is that, remember, up until the beginnings of these two new orders of the 13th century, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, they're called mendicant orders, which means they're beggars. They live among the people. They do not support themselves in the way that traditional monastic orders had, by living cloistered behind monastery walls, by having some income-producing enterprise. They live out among the people. And so I think that there's probably something here as well, because they are, for the first time, these friars are living among the people. They are, you can make sort of, I think, a sociological leap here, that in these orders, the mystics in these orders would be more publicly visible. Are y'all tracking me? They would be more publicly visible. They would have a more obvious presence, a more evident sort of mystical contemplation. And the experience of their contemplation might probably inspire others to do the same. So I think that explains why we have this explosion of the stigmatic experience in the 13th century. All these factors together. And again, as I say, I don't think that there's any question about the veracity of St. Francis's account. They do tend to appear in clusters. They do tend to appear in regions near one another. It seems to be some sort of a social explanation for that going on as well. Okay, so what I want to say, I want to sort of jump here a little bit to say, in academic speak, that there can be no denying that this phenomenon has a cultural context. Okay? That if it is indeed, as Catholic Christians can safely believe, a supernatural phenomenon, it still happens in a very specific cultural context. And so understanding that cultural context should not be scary to us. I'm not suggesting they're not true because there's a social explanation. As a matter of fact, I think it adds to the credibility to understand the society that produces this phenomenon. Does that make sense, everyone? It's culturally based. That is a neutral academic observation. It does nothing to deny these events ever happened. Stigmatics are overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. There's a surprise. There's one or two Anglicans in the 20th century. One or two Anglicans in the 20th century. But think about why that would be. Why would it be overwhelmingly Roman Catholic? Because it's the true church. Because, yes, and because we, first of all, embrace the idea of the supernatural, the miraculous in our lives, don't we? We embrace it. We believe in the redemptive power of suffering. Suffering brings redemption. For a Catholic to contemplate the wounds of Christ is the norm. It's the norm. Because we can take our own suffering in our own lives and unite it with that, and it has meaning. Do Protestants teach this? No. Are post-Protestant groups teach this? No. And I'm not going to tell you that Protestants don't believe in miracles. They do. They do. They took a much more suspicious post-Enlightenment view of these phenomena, I think, than we do. I think it is, and our Eucharistic theology, of course, is so completely different. So I don't think that it's an accident that it is a uniquely Roman Catholic phenomenon. 20th century Austrian Catholic theologian by the name of Ivan Illich said this of the Stigmata, quote, "It is pure compassion with Christ, faith so strong and so deeply incarnate that it leads to the individual embodiment of the contemplated pain of our Lord." In other words, it physically manifests itself. So, predictably, the church itself, as I mentioned earlier, has a cautious view of this. How many of you remember from the very beginning we talked about how the church seeks to disprove miracles? That's how they approach every miracle, is to disprove it, to find either that it is a pious fraud or a hoax, or to find some natural explanation. And even in the canonization process of a saint, does everybody know that the church has a person called the Advocatus Diaboli? The devil's advocate, who gives testimony against the person, why this person should not become a saint. The church applies the same rigor, perhaps even more so, to the Stigmata. Although the church simultaneously accepts that this could be true, okay, that these miracles do occur. Even in the most famous cases, Saint Francis, Saint Catherine of Siena, and Saint Padre Pio, none of their stigmatas factored into their canonization processes. None of them did. It's not even in the record. Okay, it's not considered. All right, so here's what must be recognized in order for the church to declare a true stigmatic. The wounds must appear on the same day. Now, in the case of St. Francis, he manifested 4 of the wounds on the same day. A couple of years later, he received the other one. That did not keep him from being recognized as a true stigmatic, because the 4 appeared simultaneously. They must cause considerable modification of human tissue. They must remain unaltered despite medical treatment. So the first thing, in the 21st century, the first thing that's going to happen is the church is going to call in a medical doctor to get the medical explanation. They must cause bleeding and must not result in infection. They cannot have instant or perfect healing until, in most cases, death. When the stigmata always disappears. That's another miracle. So let me sort of explore again that medical idea. And the only thing that I have been able to find in my very rigorous examination of the medical literature has led me to conclude that there is the closest medical explanation is the one that is often given for Christ sweating blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. A very similar phenomenon that is called hemihyperhidrosis, blood and sweat. The tiny capillaries beneath the skin would break, and that blood would find its way through the pores. There is no real full medical explanation for the picture I'm getting ready to show you, however, because from the most famous stigmatics, the 3 that I've highlighted, we know that they have something in common, and that is they bled profusely. It was blood. In the case of Padre Pio, we know it's human. It's his own blood. Okay? It affected them daily. It wore down their health. When Saint Francis died in 1226, remember he's afflicted in 1224. He only lived 2 more years. When he died in 1226, lots of testimony about this. His physical condition grew incredibly and increasingly weaker by the day. Probably a contributing factor was his blood loss, ongoing blood loss, every day. So this is a repeated phenomenon with Catherine of Siena. We're going to be talking a lot more about her on the 22nd, by the way, so I've sort of reserved her for then, because that's in advance of her feast day, which falls on April 29th, but Father Peter's teaching on April 29th. So I'm going to do St. Catherine of Siena in her own words, looking at her primary sources, her letters. But she is the one who received the stigmata, but through fervent prayer was given an invisible stigmata, so that it would not be seen by anyone. And then, of course, we are left with St. Padre Pio. And this is just one photograph. There are many, hundreds of them you could probably find. Remember that St. Padre Pio is a Capuchin monk who's probably the best known of all stigmatics, and it's just because we have such a visible record of his bleeding. Is also supposed to have experienced lots of other strange phenomena. If you know anything about Padre Pio, he was just an incredible mystic. So many mystical gifts, including, up to and including bilocation, the ability to be more than one place at one time. Before Padre Pio, no priest had ever received the stigmata. Since him, there have been a few, which is another interesting phenomenon we could explore a whole other time. Why not until the 20th century? Why priest in the 20th century and not before? Padre Pio had wounds on the hands and feet, on his chest, on his right shoulder, as I mentioned, where Jesus carried the cross. He had wounds visible from scourging, and he also complained with incredible pain from a crown of thorns. Although he never had visible marks on his forehead, he suffered from trigeminal neuralgia that I think a lot of certainly within the church, there's been an attempt to link his trigeminal neuralgia to the pain that Jesus would have suffered from having that cap of thorns placed on his head. All very, very, very painful. And when you think about the fact that this man lived until 1968, he received the stigmata, the first wounds that bled from the stigmata in 1910. 1910. In a letter to his spiritual director, Padre Pio says this, and this is a direct quote: "Last night something happened which I can neither explain nor understand. In the middle of my palms, a red mark appeared about the size of a penny, accompanied by acute pain in the middle of those red marks. The pain was more pronounced in the middle of my left hand, so much that today as I write this, I am able to write even though I still feel it. And also under my feet, I feel some pain in the beginnings of a wound there." And of course, what happened is that over the decades, he came to bleed like this. In many of his the films that were done, particularly, he died in 1968, so many of the films that were done in the 50s and 60s of him celebrating Mass, you can see he's attempted to cover the wounds. He wraps his hands so that people can't, he's in the Iran's position, people can't see them. But there are many of those images that he's already bled through in the celebration of the Mass. And also, of course, the other incredible story about Padre Pio is that he died in 1968, and in 2008, his body was exhumed. That is 40 years after his death. So he is an incorruptible as well. And guess what you don't see on his incorrupt, 40-year-old perfect form?
No scar.
No sign of the stigmata.